Hello to everybody. My name is Mehmet Aksit. I will give today a presentation about freedom of thought or cover up for discrimination and humiliation. And this talk will be actually based on the all kind of debates we had in the past and still today about so-called Muhammed's cartoons. The talk will have the following contents, and we will discuss all these items one by one. First of all, the question and the adopted analysis method. The question is, Muhammad's cartoons, freedom of thought, or cover up for discrimination and humiliation? To give an answer to this question, we will first adopt a guideline. And in this guideline, we first will determine the concerns related to the thought and the argument of the thought. So you can call them also dimensions, all kinds of dimensions that influence the thought. Then we define the logical interdependencies among the identified concerns, if any. We analyze the thought from the perspective of each concern, and we apply critical thinking methods about the given thought to determine logical fallacies, if any. So we will go through this method one by one. Actually, here we see all these concerns. The first concern is media bias. Anything that is discussed in public media is actually subject to media manipulation or media bias, so it is worth to look at it. Then we will focus on the thought. And of course, the thought here, in particular, we talk about so-called the event of Muhammad's cartoons. And these cartoons, they have implicit arguments about Islam. So this will be our third concern. And some people claim that actually these cartoons are actually explicit or implicit discrimination and humiliation factors in them. And altogether, of course, all these concerns influence the society, and we will apply critical thinking methods to determine if they are fallacies and give explanations if possible. So let's look at first what is media and media bias. Media bias is the bias of journalists and news producers within the mass media in the selection of many events and stories that are reported and how they are covered. The term media bias implies a pervasive or widespread bias contravening the standards of journalism rather than the perspective of an individual journalist or article. This is what I took from Wikipedia. You may read various books related to that. I have read these books, for example. So the one on the left is Fact Over Fake. I think it's a good handbook to determine fake news and bias. Fake news is somehow part of media bias. We can consider them. Joris Luijendijk, this is the Dutch version of the book, is an excellent book about his experiences in the Middle East. There are also English versions of this book. Weaponized Lies is also an interesting book because it analyzes all kind of public effects, stories, politicians' statements, and one by one identifies all kind of manipulation and actually misguidance, you may also call them. And actually he calls them weaponized lies because these lies, based on these lies, we had wars in the past. and maybe some wars are still going on. Factfulness is also an interesting book. It actually it's a more positive book. It says actually the world is better than we might expect. Misconceptions about the world matters, but it's still interesting because it emphasizes and makes it clear the misjudgments. This is actually a popular chart, a so-called media bias chart. I don't know if it really reflects the truth, but here they actually categorize newspapers and the magazines in the United States according to their bias. There are also, of course, scientific work. There are actually a lot of scientific work on this matter in journalistic studies, especially. Here, there are two articles which I found it quite useful. An interesting aspect is that detection of fake news is increasingly becoming a computer science research topic because all kinds of software tools and machine learning data analytics tools are used actually to determine the origin of news, whether it is fake or not. So it becomes actually a computer science topic to detect media bias and fake news. There is actually a call for papers somewhere this year. I think it's quite interesting, I think in June. So it became actually, or it is becoming more and more also a computer science topic. So what is a media bias? I made actually a media bias model. So assume that here is a reality and there is all kind of media here represented. Media is here, reality is here, and there are maybe all kind of interest groups may actually own the media or try to influence media by awarding or punishing. There are all kind of techniques they may use. And there are two arrows here. Let's look at this arrow. So actually media is supposed to present the reality, but while they are doing so, they may use all kind of methods like media public influence methods, like they may manipulate, they may create confusion, they bias certain aspects of the reality, they suppress, they can select, they can prioritize, they can give an emphasis, they can personalize, dramatize, and distort. So actually, if you look at the daily news, you may find a lot of practical applications of these. For example, there is maybe an event, a big event, maybe a negative event, and they make an interview with one person, and that person actually gives its opinion, and they may present it as the opinion of the majority. So this could be seen as a personalization. And when part of reality is presented, actually it's presented to the public to influence public opinion. Then they can frame, they can emphasize conflicts, they can again prioritize, speculate, or many times they do oversimplification. So they present it as a black and white kind of thing. So of course, there are interest groups nowadays. They may directly influence public, or they may try to modify reality. Because of this electronic media, it's easier for interest groups that they can exercise these practices. Here, what I didn't show here is the public policy, governmental policy. Of course, it's also government may have also very strong influence. For simplicity, I didn't put it in this figure. So the media bias is about all these methods and how reality is presented to influence public opinion by using different techniques as we have listed here. Well, there are, of course, interest groups, and the religion bias is also part of the media bias. Media bias is also classified in various ways, like conformance bias, religious bias, ethical bias, or racial bias, all these exist. What we see here is interesting newspaper, which I collected here. For example, in the United States, there was actually a news. This is taken from one of the well-established media, the newspaper. Funding Islamophobia, $260 million went to promoting hatred or American Muslims. So apparently, there are actually, I think here it's written about 74 groups finance these kind of news just to create a negative opinion about Muslims in the United States only. And this is about for 5 years, I think, from 2008 to 2000 something. So apparently, there are, of course, many publications like that. So people invest in creating media bias. So they use it as an instrument to bring their ideas or to influence the populations. This is an interesting article because this is about Muhammad's cartoons. This is a scientific paper. So it's published as a scientific paper. I will read what it is written here. Actually, it is taught that media not only presents facts and truth the way they are, but also is a mediator, which helps to form a specific worldview. Media portrays only the image of the agreed reality as a stereotype, which can modify people's thinking, feelings, or behavior. The subjective information is incorporated to common knowledge or schemes that people have of specific groups. So this paper actually studied many publications, many newspaper articles, hundreds of them, and actually about Muhammad's cartoons and made a statistical scientific analysis on that. Okay, so the question is, the media bias is the fact. We are all influenced, consciously or unconsciously. So this is my personal checkup list. I apply this checkup list. Most of the time I try to do it in order to find out actually the degree of media bias. I cannot say I'm not influenced. We are all influenced, but we may try to eliminate, as at least put it into proportion, media bias, if we consciously apply certain methods. So this is my checkup list. So be aware of non-transparent sources and premises. How reliable are the sources? Avoid non-transparent sources. So many times newspapers claim something and they say, oh, my source says that this happened, but I cannot give the name, sorry. So these are also very suspicious way of sources presenting the premises. Consider multiple sources, check the historical media bias record of the source. This is very important because existence of certain newspapers and certain people are just because they are against something consistently, whether without any argumentation. Critical thinking is the science of finding fallacies. I think we should all be equipped with the critical thinking methods. That's very important. And critical thinking actually tries to find link between premises and conclusions. How sound is the path from premises to conclusion. In principle, these two items are enough to detect media biases. However, they are quite abstract, and of course, these 2 points needs certain skills to apply these two items. So I have added more. Bias, are there evidences of bias? I just listed some bias like conformance bias, gender bias, name bias, news bias, political bias, racial and religious bias, and so forth. You may actually seek for them. Actually, also good to know the methods that which I have just presented a few slides before. If these methods are visible in the presentation of the reality. Stakeholders and benefiters, who loses and who gains in the end. Most of the time, the ones who gains do not, don't present it. They complain about something, and actually it's related to another item, causality. What is the cause and what's the effect? The people or the groups or the countries, whatever you may call them, they cause or create certain problems, and they are actually presenting them most of the time as the victims of the result, but actually they are the reasons why the problems might happen in the past. So I'm not saying this is always the case, but be careful. Creating evils and overly generalization of facts. This is also a method, systematically creating evil figures. Consider everything case by case. Don't overly generalize. Don't say, oh, this is a terrible person, this is a terrible thought, this is a terrible religion, a terrible way of looking. No, just take everything case by case and don't generalize, because this is the method they use. They try to create evils. If you just follow these evil figures or presentation of evils and create some hate feelings against them, then actually you are not thinking anymore positively or critically. So you can be easily a victim of media bias. So taking part in the solution, do problems and solutions are analyzed impartially. The journalist must not be actually part of the solution. Opinions from all sides. How would you react if you were the opposite party in the conflict? This is an important part. And this is very important, actually, implicit personal traits, because most of the people who are at the higher ranks or the managers or the political leaders, they have to be politically correct. They have to be protect the members of the club, so-called, or they are populist, which means that they want to present actually what they are expected to present, but not always the reality. I traveled quite a lot around the world, and sometimes I travel business class. I sit next to people, ambassadors or the representatives of United Nations. And when you talk to them, they actually tell different things. And when they talk to public, they tell different things. And I frequently ask, why do you think like that? And you say like that. They say, well, I have to be politically correct. I cannot say against my political party or my position and so forth. So this is actually the big problem. And I have also talked to a lot of parliamentarians, the representatives of the parliament in different countries, and in the end, they say, okay, we have to win the election. Reality always does not always give us the right number of votes. Avoid the conspiracy theories, but don't underestimate the power of mighty corporates and intelligence agencies. There are two books here I read, Noam Chomsky's book, How the World Works, very detailed book about the manipulation of the world politics. This is Economic Hitman is a more popular book, but nevertheless, I think there are some facts in it. So analysis of the thought from the perspective of media bias. Then we are talking here about Muhammad's cartoons. We can say that any major public debate is subject to media bias, including the debate on Muhammad's cartoons. Media bias is a reality, and we are all subject to it in varying degree. With the increase of electronic public media, it has become easier for the interest groups to make attempts in influencing public, because you can just publish in the electronic media and you may have impact of it. And we see, of course, in daily practice that the news are copied from person to person, and suddenly in a short time, millions of copies are everywhere in the world. We can arm ourselves against bias by using some dedicated methods, as I have just presented. But for the general public, this is extremely hard. Now, I will refer to the text from this scientific publication about media bias and Muhammad's cartoons. I will read it actually exactly as is. The results of the analysis show that in the Western media, Muslims are portrayed as the homogeneous society. We, of course, know that it's not. Homogeneous society. Whose members are in favor of violence, hostility, fanatism, and rejection of every opportunity in Western societies. The most common stereotypes in articles are Muslims, Islamists, terrorists, Muslims against freedom of press and freedom of speech. After the comparison of how different representative groups are participating in construction of Muslim and Islam stereotypes, it is revealed that the content of an article depends on author. Western media quotes many politicians, writers, and journalists who encourage the marginalization and stigmatization of Muslims and reproduction of Islamophobia. The language used in articles creates dichotomy between us and they, which add to the negative society opinion about Muslims because the alleged threat to the Western security and values are related with the image of extremist, radical, terrorist Muslims. So this is based on a very detailed scientific study. Okay, now let's look at the thought. This was the other dimension. So let's look at the terminology. Again, this I took from Wikipedia. Because freedom of thought or freedom of expression or speech, I will use the word thought because thought says there is some thinking in it or some premise or the conclusion in it. So it's actually based on clash of forces. Freedom of thought is to express opinions and ideas without fear of retaliation, censorship, or legal sanction. It's recognized as a human right. Okay, but the exercise of these rights carries special duties and responsibilities and may therefore be subject to certain restrictions when necessary for respect of the rights of reputation of others or for protection of national security of public order, public or of public health and morals. So they give also actually all kind of examples like libel, slander, obscenity, pornography, incident, fighting words, classified information, copyright violation, etc., etc. So freedom of thought is never considered as a right in an absolute sense. When you talk about freedom of thought, you always have to look also the rights and duties and the conditions. It's frequently presented as an absolute concept, but it's not an absolute concept. It's a relative concept with respect to the conditions that it brings. So what is a thought, by the way? So assume that we are at a pop concert and somebody is shouting fire. And then it causes a panic and maybe many people die. So this person cannot say, I have the freedom of shouting whatever I want. You cannot do that. You have responsibilities. Or this guy in the figure actually curses to someone or to group or whatever. And of course, he doesn't really mean most of the time what he says. Many times, you know, in English, we know that there's a famous curse and people don't really mean it when they use these words. So it's actually humiliation. It's meant for humiliation or similar reasons why someone may curse. Of course, we don't want to analyze here why people curse, but cursing, of course, it doesn't give you, it is not the right that you humiliate or you put, you downgrade other people. So there are some implicit arguments of the Muhammad's cartoons. Let me summarize these implicit arguments. The first argument is terrorism or terrorist thoughts are at the core of Islam. Why it is like that? Because this argument is deducted from the depiction of Prophet Muhammad, who is at the heart of Islam as a terrorist. So if you say Muhammad is terrorist, actually you are saying the heart of Islam, the core of Islam is actually encouraging terrorism. This is the first argument. The second argument is Islam is the religion of lust. This argument is deducted because of various depiction of women in the cartoons as lust objects of man. So these claims are not new, by the way. In the past, there were similar arguments against Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. Other early arguments were, for example, Muhammad had epilepsy, was ignorant, stole the Quranic text from other sources. Quran is full of errors. Some of these arguments are also implicitly present in the Muhammad's cartoons. So we cannot say there are no arguments in these cartoons. There are arguments. Most of the cartoons, of course, they have implicit arguments, or we will call them later symbolic arguments. So analysis of the cartoons from the perspective of the freedom of thought perspective, the cartoons made implicit arguments about Muslims, which cannot be denied. Moreover, using these cartoons, that's very important, the public media frequently associate Muslims with violence, hostility, fanaticism, etc. So what we see here is that the effect of cartoons are multiplied, and actually the scientific study shows that as well. And actually people are repeating and using these cartoons and again, and the reactions to these cartoons to depict Islam and Muslims in a bad way. Any debate on a particular thought should be analyzed from two perspectives: the freedom of thought and the possible emergence of unwanted effects created by the thought. And actually, this is also declared in the definition of freedom of thought or freedom of expression. Yes, you have the freedom, but, okay, if certain conditions appear, like copyright violations, like humiliation, like discrimination, we have to put a question mark there. It is clear that cartoons can't cause controversies, but the freedom of thought problem distracted attention from the possible emergence of unwanted effects. So people, actually, the whole debate distracts the attention to the freedom of thought problem. And other aspects are not discussed as equal as the first problem, which is the problem of freedom of thought. Okay, now let's look at Islam. By the way, in this talk, this part is not about proof or disproof of the existence of God. When I use the term God, I refer also to Allah, so I don't make distinction in this talk between God and Allah. Of course, people may discuss, they are not the same thing and this and that. But when I refer to Allah, I mean Allah as it is presented in the Quran. This is at least my assumption now to make things simple. This part does not make claims about Islam if it is the right faith or not. This presentation is aimed to be an impartial presentation of Islam. So we are just looking at it impartially and try to see actually the effect of Islam and the relation of the thought and claims and media bias, etc. So the presentation here is my interpretation. Some people may agree, some people may not agree, but I have to give also my interpretation, of course, on this matter. In my previous slide, I said, okay, I don't claim it's the true faith or not. But by looking in an impartial way, we can see that actually there are two theological methods in Islam today. We consider two categories. Quran is the main source. All other sources must be filtered through the perspective of Quran. If Quran does not explicitly mention or imply a premise or an argument, no divine rules are valid on these claims. So in other words, these are not divine, not necessarily coming as a whole completely from the God. No human touch verse is considered purely divine. So if human interpretation is a part of it, it is considered not purely divine. Quran, the second way of the method is Quran is the main source, but there are other sources which must be also considered in addition to Quran. Both approaches agree on the divine nature of Quran. So these, I think, two dominating Islamic methods now. So the implication of assuming that Quran is the only 100% trustable reference, however, there are some implications of this. Quranic text should be divinely precise as the nature, since both universe and Quran are created by the same divine authority, God. So that means it must be infinitely precise and infinitely correct, because it is not human-made, it is made by divine authority. Quranic text, and as a consequence, Islam should be independent of any tradition, since God is independent of any tradition. So I am interested personally, for example, in history of religions. I'm also interested in many other religions, also the very ancient ones. And many of them actually, they carry traditions in the traditions in the people and the region and the habits are included in the religion. But if Quran says, if Allah says, if this is the 100%, the trustable source, then we can say, okay, then it should be independent of any tradition. Quran can be, must be studied using scientific methods, linguistics, natural and social sciences, and logic. For a given argumentation in Quran, all the related Quranic verses must be considered together. In case of a perceived inconsistency, ambiguity, impreciseness, the context of the events when divine revelations were received, the alternative meanings of the terms, related verses and logic must be consulted, and a consistent solution must be found out. So this is the commonly used method for the first group of people. Some of the followers of the second method claim that in this approach, however, the heritage of Prophet Muhammad and the religious authorities are disrespected, the context of religion becomes too narrow, and traditions are abandoned. So this is the argument of the second group, sometimes, not everybody. But the implication of considering other sources, however, the followers of the first method claim that if the second approach is taken, there's a high probability of attributes of traditions are included into Islam. Alternative parallel pathways are introduced, which are stated in Quran. Certain rules are introduced, which are not stated in Quran. Certain social hierarchies and privileged roles are introduced, which are not stated in Quran. Religious is tailored to the needs of political interests of some people or social class. Inconsistency may be introduced, since human beings cannot be divinely precise. So this is the counter argument from the first group. So let's look at the definition of Islam from the Quran, and certainly we raise in every nation a messenger. Say, we believe in Allah, which are revealed unto us and which was revealed unto Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes, and that which Moses and Jesus received, and that which the prophets received from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and unto him we have surrendered. Surely the religion of Allah, the religion with Allah is Islam. Based on these Quranic perspectives, referring to certain periods of time as pre-Islamic period is not meaningful. So here we have actually a very specific case if we compare to other religions or religions in the past. According to Quran, Islam refers to a religion which has started much before Muhammad, and it is described in the messengers of the prophets Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and all other prophets, which are explicitly mentioned in Quran, and the unnamed ones who are sent to every nation. So there are also the many Muslim people make this mistake. So sometimes Muslim people have difficulties to explain this as well to themselves, but nevertheless, this is taken from Quran. A definition of Muslim is a person who accepts by heart and openly. This is the most common definition. God, Allah, and the Prophet Muhammad is a Muslim. No authority is required to approve if someone is Muslim or not. Some legislations, however, in the world require registration of religions of citizens. Muslim is a person who believes in Islam. Quran calls the believers of the past prophets are also Muslim. So in this, since we accept that the religion of Allah is Islam, if we accept this, then also the past prophets are Islamic prophets, then people of their followers are also Muslims. This is a logical conclusion. So-called 6 basic articles of faith and 5 pillars of Islam are accepted by many Muslims. However, there are also opinions, arguments about the number and the content of these articles and pillars. Some claim that the whole Quran is the pillar. So there are actually discussions here about this matter. So I will draw a diagram here. So the first one, categorize them. The first one says actually Quran is divine and all sorts of information must be filtered through the Quranic way. Quran is divine, but some other additional source information might be considered as well. So this is the second group. And most of the time when you analyze so-called religious schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali, I also add them there, Jafiri, Shia, Alawi, and other interpretations. Most of the time they add certain things to the Quran and say, well, okay, this is Quran, but these things must be considered in addition to Quran. There are also Sufi traditions. They are difficult to place them. Some of them don't actually care about whether you have belong to religious school or not. Most of them, some do. Some add things to Quran actually. So there are many versions of them. Sufi traditions inspired by God and human relations. So the relation of human beings to and God, and the adjectives of God, or the so-called beautiful names of God. Okay. So there are also outlaws who do not fit, of course, into this picture. But myself, my observation is that what about the Muslim person? So, of course, people have their own look and they are affected from different thoughts. So I classify them as the role of the religion and conscious believer or not. Many believers may not be conscious. It's just a tradition or inherited from parents. Choose among alternative interpretations or just commit to one. They may say, okay, if you are Hanafi, follow Hanafi. Some people say, I take this from Hanafi, from Shafi, and so forth. They also exist. Most of them intelligent, so-called intelligent, highly educated people may be more flexible. Attitude towards hadith and jurisprudence, so in the history, acceptance of the existence of privileged persons in the religion. There are especially some in Sufi tradition, some people are privileged, they have some vision, and they may, for example, get you closer to Allah, as I said, I'm not giving any verdict on these things. I just present as I observe. Believe in hidden meanings of Quran. Some says it's Quran is written like that, but actually it means like that. Some people do that. Some actually religious streams do that. Believe in explicit facts or unexplained happenings, whether there is a scientific load or superstition look, giving meanings to happenings which are not necessarily scientifically or logically based. Assume that some verses of Quran now became infinite. There are also people like that, which actually the most of the time first group categorically rejects because they say then it's you are touching with human touch on the divine property of Quran. Attitude towards elements of traditions and borrowings from other beliefs. Generally, Quran as when you read it, when you may get an impression, okay, if something is not allowed, then it's explicitly written. If something is implicitly or explicitly not forbidden, then you have the freedom of choice. Attitudes towards the effect of politics. So we also know that when you study history of religion, a lot of political struggles actually influence the habits and traditions, and maybe even you may think that's a part of religion, but it may be the result of some political conflict. So when we look at all these variations, I call this, let's say, the traditional interpretation of the Islam, and there are always outlaws. Every religion has outlaws, but the religious authorities in any of these actually, of course, consider the other thoughts are inappropriate. So the first statement, terrorism or terrorist thoughts are at the core of Islam. All theological interpretations strongly reject this argument and what is called jihadism. So actually jihadism is a Western world. Islamic theologians says you cannot force someone in religion on the basis of Quranic examples. So here we have Quranic examples, text. As I said, Quran must be interpreted as a whole. If anyone slew a person, unless it is to be a murder or by spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. So all these Quranic items, whether open or secret, take not life. Surely Allah enjoins the doing of justice. I'm not reading them because of lack of time. I think you can look at all these verses. In the end, the official interpretations, whether you are Hanbali or whether you are Hanafi or Shafi, they all agree that Quran advises, or you look at Islam purely from Quranic perspective and filter all other thoughts accordingly. They all agree that Quran advises to refrain from aggression. The verses in Quran that refer to war and killing are valid only during war conditions and only for self-defense. In fact, these verses were given when Muslims were under attack. When the danger is over, it's advised to stop the animosity. Okay, so the first argument is rejected. And the second argument, Islam is the religion of lust. Theologians following the first method, Quran is the main source, all other sources must be filtered from the perspective of Quran, strongly reject this claim and state that it is derived from wrong translation, and this claim does not have a Quranic origin. I put here two references from a religious professor and a theologist, but these are in Turkish. There may be other English versions as well. Also, a majority of theologians from the second group claim that women are not the lust objects of men, although some may give what I will call maybe sometimes woman unfriendly interpretations in compared to the first group. Okay, this is my way of looking at Islam in an impartial way, so I don't take a part of it. All theological interpretations of Islam reject the arguments presented by the cartoons. Like any religion, there are outlaws in Islam which are rejected by the theologians of Islam. No authority is required to approve if someone is Muslim or not. As such, even outlaws may call themselves Muslims. They don't have to get a certificate from someone. Muslims do not approve the term moderate Muslim, referring to Muslims who disprove extremism. Their claim is, by looking at outlaws, you cannot classify normal Muslim as moderate. Otherwise, every group should be classified accordingly, such as moderate men. When we look at the newspapers, men do terrible things. So do we classify them as normal men, a moderate man, or an extreme man? No. Moderate woman, moderate something, etc. So this is the reaction of formal or the let's say theological part of Islam against the implicit claims of the cartoons. So what is discrimination and humiliation? This is the next topic. Discrimination is the act of making unjustified distinctions between human beings based on the groups, classes, or other categories to which they are perceived to belong. I think humiliation is even here more important, the term, because discrimination most of the time creates humiliation. Humiliation is the abasement of pride, which creates mortification or leads to a state of being humbled or reduced to lowliness or submission. Again, these are taken from Wikipedia. So we make an assumption here. We say freedom of thought cannot be justified if it is an act of discrimination and or humiliation. You remember when we talk about freedom of thought, we say freedom of thought, yes, but it's not an absolute concept. There are always conditions that must be considered when we discuss about the freedom of thought. Of course, we have to be specific about the thought. To determine if a thought violates this criterion requires a specific analysis of the thought. So, so when we look at it, there are actually very good books. I think humiliation is the problem of today and possibly tomorrow, because the degree of humiliation, we see that it increases. So we have to be all governed against it. So I advise you actually to read this book. It's an excellent book. It's about understanding humiliation. I will read from the book. Humiliation provokes suicide, mass murders such as school killings, and other kinds of violence as in terrorist acts, not least the bombing of civilians. Research also identifies a link between humiliation and depression or anxiety. Clearly, humiliation can drive people into psychologically compromised states, which in turn may develop into self or other directed violence. It is horrible to feel the emotion of being humiliated, which involves a public loss of face and shame. From our workplaces and homes to hospitals and schools and onto our streets, humiliation is taking over. In most cases, however, it is the weakest of civilians who are most likely to suffer at the bottom of the humiliation chain. In the tabloid press and in social media, humiliation brings ridicule, and the humiliated are told to suck it up rather than being allowed to argue that they did not deserve this. So they even don't give any chance for argumentation. The humiliated are represented as bringing it up upon themselves by their own actions and emotions. So most of the time, this book also discusses this with examples. This book gives many useful examples from personal cases, actually they have collected. Humiliation and shame, here are the terminologies, and actually in order to understand humiliation and shame, you have to read actually all these, understanding all these terminologies, but it can, for example, humiliation is feeling of unjustness, but eventually it may turn into shame, and you may say, yes, they are right to do this to me. You know, you may come up with the conclusion, yes, they are right that they are doing this to me. Often humiliation is aligned with shame. However, these are not the same. The most important difference between shame and humiliation is that shame is self-inflicted, while others inflict humiliation upon us. So when you are subject to humiliation, it may turn into a shame. You may handle it in some way, or it may cause certain reactions. So these are all studied in the various research fields of psychology. Humiliation is studied in psychological studies. Uh, Humiliation, like other emotional states, prepares the young person for reaction. Automatic reaction to humiliation is controlled or uncontrolled anger. Some of these young people will commit suicide, while others will create long-term plans for avenging what has happened to them. They can also turn into extremist organizations aided by the internet and rationalize their private humiliations into a bigger context, be it racism, survival of a religious group, or a radical political agenda, such as what we find currently in the self-styled Islamic State. Their alter egos comprise a grandiose self-image, and their main preoccupation besides secret planning is preparing for some kind of attack. These attacks seem directed at either those who have emulated them in the past or groups that represent them in some way. The secret planning stage makes them feel special and offers a kind of psychological refuge. They take comfort from imagining what they will do to those who devaluated and disrespected them. So these are all taken from this book. And actually, I have read a number of books on this topic, and they all refer more or less the same thing. There is another very nice book, actually a scientific book about humiliation, degradation, dehumanization. And there is a part here about collective humiliation. And in the collective humiliation, many people think that the Muhammad caricatures were not humiliating, even though people of Islamic religion might be subject to diverse threats in Western societies. They were not humiliating, they say, because they were not intended to humiliate, but only to mock. This accounts for a striking difference between direct group humiliations and representative group humiliations on the one hand and symbolic group humiliations on the other. Normally, humiliations do not have to be intended as humiliations and not even to perceive as humiliations in order to be humiliating. In case of symbolic humiliations, a direct connection between the symbolic act and the humiliation of the victim is absent. The connection has to be established through intentions. This is also a very useful book. This is from a chapter from this book is about collective humiliation. So, analysis of the thought from the perspective of humiliation. Freedom of thought cannot be justified if it is an act of discrimination and or humiliation. This was our assumption. It is horrible to feel the emotion of being humiliated, which involves a public loss of face and shame. Humiliation, like other emotional states, prepares the young person for reaction. The automatic reaction to humiliation is controlled or uncontrolled anger. Many people think that the Muhammad cartoons were not humiliating because they were not intended to humiliate, but only to mock. Muhammad cartoons, however, let many Muslim people feel humiliated, and this kind of humiliation can be called symbolic group humiliations. And don't underestimate the effect of politicians and media bias, of course, amplified it in many times. Okay, so let's come to the verdict and critical thinking. I'm not going deep in critical thinking because this method is not that complex actually to analyze in a complicated way, but let me give some terminology. Critical thinking is the analysis of facts to form a judgment. The subject is complex and several different definitions exist, which generally include rational, skeptical, unbiased analysis or evaluation of factual evidence. This is from Wikipedia. So an argument, we have to know what is a premise and what is an argument. So most of the time, critical thinking books or the methodologies, actually you have some premises, and these premises are combined in some way, and you want to make a conclusions with it. Here, the red dots actually in this figure shows logical function. What do the critical thinking methods do is to look if the premises can lead to a sound conclusion, as the claim somebody claims. What they do is that actually they defined about 50 to 70 fallacies. And when you read these critical thinking books, you are trained to identify fallacies. I think it's a very, very useful thing to know and to govern with. The problem is that if you are becoming expert in critical thinking, then you see so many, you hear so many fallacies in the daily life that your heads are beeping all the time. So that's the side effect of it. But let's see what is an opinion. An opinion is an unsupported claim of an argument is a supported claim. This is very important. The burden of proof for any position usually rests on the participant who sets forth the position. If and when opponent asks, the proponent should provide an argument for that position. So that's very important. Now, what I want to actually emphasize here is the ethics, a code of intellectual conduct. It is taken from this excellent book. It's on the web. I advise everybody to read this book. Due to unwillingness of scientific debate by the media, the arguments of the cartoons do not fulfill the ethics, the code of intellectual conduct. Unfortunately, lack of scientific discussion over this controversy prevents us to come to a well-thought conclusion on this matter. So if you have any conclusion or premise, if you want to carry a debate on that, you have to follow these principles, the fallibility principle, the truth-seeking principle, and so forth. So if you don't follow these principles in any debate, actually you are not fulfilling the ethics of the debate, a code of intellectual conduct. Clearly, the discussion about Muhammad's cartoons, most of the time they do not follow the ethics. So it is not ethical from the perspective of these 12 principles, which everybody who carries out a debate, I think, should follow these principles. Otherwise, it's not ethical. So what is the verdict? Within the context of Muhammad's cartoons, it's not difficult to identify the fallacy in the public statements. The canonical rule for accepting a thought as free should be in the form. Freedom of thought, yes, it is true. If there is a thought, so it shouldn't be a curse or anything like that, and no acceptable condition against it. Neglecting the second part is the main fallacy, which could be avoided if a scientific debate was carried on the second part. This could be carried out by a holistic consideration of the relevant concerns, such as freedom of thought, yes, but also let's discuss the responsibilities as defined in the human rights declarations. Media and media bias, we should be aware of it, what kind of methods they use, because we see that actually media multiplied the effect of these cartoons. And actually, even the cartoons didn't mean that because of ignorance or whatever it could be. Media bias turned into humiliation and a bias, religious bias. The religion of Islam and Islamic theology, you cannot look at the outlaws, these experts in Islamic theology says this is not Islam. So you have to at least go into a debate and discuss on the religious facts and claims, no matter which category they are in, these religious theologies, they all agree on these two matters, two claims that I have presented. Humiliation is the problem of our age and of our future. So we have to be careful with it, and we have to consider the research work also on psychology and critical thinking. Logic actually requires us to actually carry out debates and obeying the ethics of it. It is a known empirical fact that the studies of psychology that extreme group humiliation may cause frustration and anger by some people who cannot handle the humiliation in a proper way. We cannot say, oh, they shouldn't do that. Well, there is reality. We don't have to, at least from ethical and scientific point of view, we have to carry out this debate in this way. We should consider systematic humiliation to be a crime against humanity as well, just like restricting the freedom of thought without any valid reason. So the current situation and my suggestion. So there is a thought, for example, as an example, the cartoons, arguments against Islam, elements of symbolic humiliation. There is a claim not intended to humiliate. They say, well, we just want to mock. Yes, but some people, some journalists only take the first part of it, freedom of thought, not responsibilities. And it goes through the media bias effect, amplifies and amplifies. And it creates group humiliation. People say we are humiliated. You don't listen to us. You don't carry out a fair debate with us. And there are some outlaws, and we are considered as a special case of Islam. No, this is the Islam as it is defined in Quran and the traditions. So there is a group humiliation. It causes personal humiliation. Some people can defend themselves in some way because of personal attitude or character, but some people may, results in shame. They withdraw, they isolate themselves, and some get angry, and a very few people in this anger situation who had terrible experience in the past may be harmful and may cause some harmful effects. So instead of following this path, we advise this path. Okay, freedom of thought, yes, but let's take responsibilities with it. So let's take scientific study of all these items, freedom of thought, media bias. Let's look at media bias. There are some researchers say there is a very strong bias and actually they depict the Islamic people as a homogeneous society. It's not. Media, let's listen at the theological opinions about it. No, they don't do that. So if you don't do that, if you don't do scientific study, then it is also, as I said, not ethical. So let's have this debate, yes, but let's ask the experts and people from that religion as well, including people from journalistic studies, psychology, and plan and carry out a personal healing and improvement. Avoid humiliation. Handle extremism, the outlaws, in the right way without any bias, using the knowledge of journalistic studies, Islamic theology, psychology, and sociology. So we have to consider this. So when you are a Muslim and you say to them, hey, you belong to the terror and extremism, this and that, this guy has two choices. Either say, oh, I don't care what you say, or becomes, in a shameful position, or said, if you say that's my religion, terrorism, then I do terrorism if I'm not a stable person. Many studies show that. It's not, of course, only in this case. We see a lot of acts of violence because of extreme humiliation and because of weaknesses of persons. Okay, so this was my talk. Actually, If there are any questions, very welcome to ask.